The Evergreen Media Network Studio, powered by Scott Tree Services.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be back. I'm Dr. Brett Hockey. I'm here with my wife, Dr. Felice Hockey. This is the Preventus podcast. We've got a really exciting episode today. And, so thus far we've talked about insulin resistance. We talked at length about insulin resistance, and then we talked about cardiovascular health, heart health, and we kind of did a deep dive into the nuance with regard to cholesterol. And one of the things that we've talked about in those two topics, we've touched on briefly, is this idea of hormone balance and hormone optimization. And I think that brings us to the next topic, which is today's topic, and that is everything that you wanted to know in 30 minutes about thyroid hormone. And so we want to talk about thyroid hormone, and we also want to talk about how it relates to cardiovascular health, how it relates to insulin resistance. But before we talk about this, let's just kind of start with the basics. And so, Dr. Felice Hockey, what's the function of thyroid?
Okay, well, first of all, you're really challenging us to do this in 30 minutes, really?
Right. Exactly.
We're probably going to be doing another series. I know us.
Yes,
we get really, overly ambitious about things, and then we realize, wow, there's a lot to unpack here. So your thyroid gland, which kind of sits right about here in your neck, okay, for those who can see me, you can go to YouTube and watch us, is a metabolic gland. Okay, so it handles all the metabolic functions of the body. I mean, that's really far reaching, from brain health, the way we think, how fast we think, metabolic health. You often hear people say, my metabolism is slowing down. I actually giggle because I think to myself, knowing what I know, they're really talking about their thyroid most of the time. So it does impact how we burn calories and the energy that is utilized. It impacts our temperature and our temperature regulation, our bowel health. It has a very large role in our immune system and our immune health. So it is really, really a far-reaching gland. And what I find to be a really good analogy, I heard it once, and I'm stealing it from a teacher of mine in the past. She said the thyroid is very much the conductor of the hormone symphony. So it really is the conductor. It controls everything. It's sort of known as the master gland. Would you agree?
1,000,000%. And I think one of the things we want to do is get into a little bit of nuance as far as the different organ systems that it affects, and the list is long. Before we do that, though, let's just give a basic outline of thyroid physiology, if we can kind of try to...
the pathway?
The pathway,
yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, so first of all, I have to say in medical school, and I think a lot of doctors would agree with this, I really struggled with understanding thyroid and how it worked and the pathway and this negative feedback loop, which I'm going to explain to you. So if we could we have a little diagram. It's really simplified, by the way. So if you are following us on our YouTube channel, the Preventus podcast, you'll be able to see this picture. And so basically it starts in the hypothalamus, which is an area in our brain. And there is a chemical that's released that it acts almost like a messenger, and it's called thyroid releasing hormone. And it tells the anterior pituitary, which is another organ in our brain, okay? And it really handles a lot of our hormone regulation. It tells the anterior pituitary to release something called thyroid stimulating hormone. That TSH, which any of you who have had their thyroid checked has had that lab checked. There is no doubt in my mind, okay? That at the very least, every doctor checks a TSH. That TSH then signals the thyroid gland, and it kind of is sort of like a whip. I always say it's like a crack of a whip, and it's saying, come on, thyroid gland, let's go, secrete thyroid hormone. And the two thyroid hormones that are released mainly from the thyroid gland are T4 and T3. They're not entirely sure what the percentage release is, but the consensus is about 80% of the thyroid releases T4 and about 20% releases T3. Well, here's the interesting part of the story, is something I didn't learn till way later, way beyond medical school and residency, is that T4 is very much an inactive thyroid hormone. It's what's called a prohormone. It's pretty much sole purpose is to turn into or convert into T3. T3 is the active form of thyroid. And that, both of them, T4 and T3, will speak back in a negative feedback loop to the TSH and TRH, but we're talking TSH, and they tell it to, shh, quiet, we're good. So what usually signifies low thyroid, and this is the part that's confusing to a lot of people, including myself at one point, low thyroid is usually signified by a higher TSH. So I always use the analogy of a mother calling for her children. If you think of the mother as TSH, she's calling for her children, T4 and T3, and they don't answer, meaning they're not really working or they're not around. What does she do? She gets louder. Now she's in a panic. Where are my children? So TSH going up higher usually signifies a low functioning thyroid. And a T4 and a T3 that are low or on the lower end usually also represent a lower functioning thyroid. So that's my best way of describing it in a simplified manner.
There's two things that I want to play off of that. So the first thing is you hear a lot of people talking about a goiter, okay, or iodine deficiency. So with the model that you just explain to the audience how a goiter develops based on, low thyroid, TSH, all those kinds of things, and what a goiter a lot of times, what is a goiter, and then a lot of times what can it signify?
Okay, well, goiter basically, in a very simplistic explanation, comes from iodine deficiency. There's actually an area in the country called the goiter belt, which is Midwest, isn't it?
I think so.
Yeah,
right,
and there's essentially like an iodine deficiency, and so you'll see a lot of goiters. And goiters are you might have noticed them on somebody, maybe your own self. You have one, and it's the thyroid looks enlarged, and the neck will look kind of just heavier, fatter. And sometimes it is an actual goiter and not actual fat. And so there are many reasons for actual low thyroid, one of which can be an iodine deficiency.
Right.
I mean, really, the reasons for low thyroid are far-reaching. You can have an autoimmune disease like Hashimoto's disease, which is an autoimmune attack on the thyroid. There's functionally low thyroid, which, I'll go into my own story a little bit later on, which is what I believe I had. And the reasons for functionally low thyroid are really, I'm not even sure they've put their finger on exactly what causes it. You'll see it with aging. You'll see it with leaky gut or bowel abnormalities. So I really actually think that's where mine stemmed from. But so am I describing it?
Yeah,
what are you looking for exactly?
Just generally speaking, it's kind of a guess what I'm guessing. But generally speaking, a goiter is an enlargement of the thyroid, and to put the model that you just talked about into, to compare that to the goiter. The goiter is when the thyroid gland is not putting it out enough T4 or T3. A lot of times that might be due to iodine deficiency. There might be an autoimmune issue. You might actually have a selenium deficiency, but whatever the reason, your body's not getting enough T4 or T3, and the anterior pituitary responds by kicking out more thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. That TSH then basically tells the thyroid to make more T4, T3, but it also enlarges the thyroid, and we see that anatomically in the form of a goiter. So that's what a goiter is. But
can I just also say, not everyone who has low thyroid has to have a goiter.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And not everyone with a goiter, I have also noticed this, don't always have overt hypothyroidism or thyroid abnormalities in terms of their lab numbers.
Right. So you mentioned something before, and this is, I think, one of the really take-home points to the entire talk in the next 30 minutes. But there's a difference between what we would refer to as clinical hypothyroidism and then somebody who is not optimal in terms of their thyroid. And, this gets into this whole idea that if you look around our country, we have an obesity epidemic, we have an insulin resistance epidemic, we have a metabolic syndrome epidemic, and we seem to kind of be stuck in this idea that unless you meet the criteria for clinical hypothyroidism, then you don't warrant potential replacement. So talk a little bit about those differences and maybe relate it to your story, because I think it's interesting.
Yeah. So I think I left out a little bit of the pathway. So I'd like to just complete that before I go over what you want me to. So basically you have that TSH, which signals the thyroid to secrete T4 and T3, mainly T4, 80%. And then that T4's job in the tissues, okay, all the tissues of the body are supposed to turn into or convert into one of two things, T3 and reverse T3. I will wager you bet most listeners right now will say, what the heck's reverse T3? And I've never had that checked. All of our patients have, okay? So it's really an important piece to the puzzle of thyroid. And reverse T3 almost acts like a blocker to thyroid, whereas T3 is sort of the key to the engine. That's my analogy I'll use for patients to understand it. T3 is turning the engine on and is the key. T4, reverse T3, acts very much like a pin in the keyhole. It doesn't allow the key to turn, so it blocks. So if you have too much reverse T3 and too little T3, and you have symptoms of low thyroid, you are most likely functionally low thyroid.
Absolutely. And just to summarize the point, so T4 can convert, which is biologically inactive, can convert into T3, which is biologically active, or it can convert into reverse T3. Reverse T3 will hit the receptor site of the T3, wherever those T3 receptor sites, but instead of activating the receptor site, it actually inhibits the receptor site. The other, I think, key point is that as we get older, there's an enzyme that's required to convert T4 into T3. That enzyme is called deiodinase, because the only difference between T4 and T3 is an iodine molecule. That enzyme removes a molecule of iodine from the T4, you get T3. That enzyme decreases with age. So the reality is we are less able to effectively convert T4 into T3 as we age, and T3 is the biologically active form. So with all that in mind, talk about your experience and how maybe you didn't quite meet what we would call criteria for frank hypothyroidism, but you were suboptimal in terms of your thyroid function.
Okay, so I'll tell you what's classically done in a conventional system. Patient comes in, maybe complains of some low thyroid symptoms. I'm gaining weight, I'm tired, I'm cold, okay? I'm foggy brained, I have dry skin, I'm having constipation. And by the way, you do not have to have all of these things, okay? But if you look up low thyroid and their symptoms, your head will spin off. It is a lot, okay? And it seems sort of nebulous. But what you will find is most conventional docs will check a TSH. And if you're lucky, they'll check a free T4, okay? The reality is you'll also want a free T3 and a reverse T3 to see the entire picture. I use this analogy too much, but if I give you 2 pieces to a 100-piece puzzle, you are not going to make out the picture of the puzzle. And that's the same thing with thyroid. So you are getting a disservice if only a TSH or a T4 are checked, I'm sorry to say. And I'm not knocking my colleagues. I used to do it exactly that way too. And unfortunately, we missed the mark. What you'll find, and I will use Quest reference ranges because we use Quest labs the most, okay? What you will find in clinical hypothyroidism is you will find a TSH over, I think it's 4.5 is the upper end. You will find a TSH over 4.5, and you will find in this case, a conventional doctor would check just a T4. You'll find a T4 on the lower end of under 0.8, okay? All right, so there's your overt hypothyroidism. And then there's subclinical, which is essentially your thyroid hormones. I think it's the TSH is normal and the T4 is low. In any event, I would rarely call that subclinical. Subclinical would indicate that the patient doesn't have symptoms, and 99% of these people have symptoms.
Right.
Okay. So now I've given you the conventional, and then I'm going to give you what happened to me years ago, prior to me going into functional medicine. I was, gaining weight. I had gained around 17, 18 pounds. It was very uncomfortable. I was retaining water. I was cold all the time. It was freezing cold. That is actually the most common presenting symptom of a low thyroid patient, is they will be cold and everybody else is fine. They're in a room and they're like, oh, is everyone cold? And everyone else is like, we're fine. I used to pick up my kids in the middle of summer from whatever camp, and I wouldn't have the AC on. And they would be like, Mom, it's so hot outside. Can we put the AC on? I'd be like, I'm cold. I was like thawing out constantly. So I had all of these symptoms and this weight gain, which would not budge despite a healthy diet, despite exercise, despite everything. And my brain was foggy. I'd have to reread sentences. I was just really struggling in all areas of life. I ended up seeing a doctor down south, who's a great doctor, a functional medicine doctor. And he checked my labs and he noted that my T3 was sitting at around 2.4, which the T3 range is 2.3 to 4.2 per quest. So I was about 2.4.
So you were normal, but you were way low normal.
Exactly.
Right.
And my TSH, I want to say, I wish I could go back to these labs. They're so many years ago. I want to say it was like 3 point something. Again, quote unquote normal. But I had all these low thyroid symptoms. And this doctor, being a functional medicine doctor, being well trained in thyroid and how to look at it, said to me, "Are you cold all the time? Tell me all your symptoms." And we went through everything. And he said, "Yeah, you have low thyroid." And he said, "You need to be treated."
So let's stop right there for just a second. So first of all, what he was doing is actually treating the patient and not treating the lab, number one. And because we have these reference ranges, a lot of doctors would say, okay, your TSH is not above 4.5 and your T4 is not below 0.8. And so therefore you're not hypothyroid, and that's the end of the story. And what he did is he said, you know what, your TSH is starting to creep up. And he actually looked at your T3 as well. We like to have a T3 in the optimal range in the upper 3s or maybe 4, low 4s. Your TSH was 2.4. So the active form of your thyroid was low normal. So he said, you're basically clinically hypothyroid.
Yeah.
And so let's talk about your treatment plan, and then let's compare that to sometimes how in the conventional realm. And let's also understand that most people, and this is just the way that we're trained, we're not even going to start treating until that TSH goes over 4.5 and the T4 drops below 0.8. And then we're going to talk about the way it's typically treated and the way that you were treated. So
yeah, so the typical treatment, if anyone listening has low thyroid will know, the typical treatment in first line is something called Synthroid, which is the brand name for levothyroxine, which is T4.
Right.
It's basically T4 if you look at its components. And so you are basically giving this patient T4, which is fine for some people, absolutely. And you are now requiring that patient to convert that T4 into T3, which we have already found there is a large percentage of the population with low thyroid, overtly low thyroid, who do not perform that conversion very well. And if you don't, then you will remain low thyroid, even though some of the numbers may look nicer to the doctor. Don't forget, T4 also feedback inhibits the TSH. So it'll make the number look nicer. The patient still will say, "But doc, I'm still not losing weight. I still feel very tired in the afternoons. I'm cold." And the doctor looks at the numbers, T4 and TSH, and says, "No, you're fine, and have a nice day." Okay. Well, that's not okay to the patient. The doctor goes on to see his next patient. So that is how it is conventionally treated. And I will say I'm not knocking that treatment because it does work for some people. It absolutely does. For those people who can convert it to T3, they're fine. Okay. Then in our realm, the way we treat it.
Well, let's back up for just a second. So just to summarize, someone that is most of the time you'll wait for the TSH to go well over 4.5 or the T4 to be below 0.8. We'll treat it with T4, which is the inactive form. The T4 will feedback inhibit, so it'll decrease the TSH. We will recheck. A lot of times the TSH, it drops below 4.5, and then we say you're therapeutic. Meanwhile, the patient's symptoms haven't improved.
Yes.
So contrast that with the way that you were treated when you went down to go see that functional medicine doctor down south.
Yeah. So actually, a lot of people don't know. If you look at the history of thyroid, it's actually alarming. Synthroid was one of the first FDA-approved drugs on the market. So the FDA kind of came on the scene 40s, 50s timeframe. And they were there to, create a safe environment for consumers, for patients. And so their initial reasoning was, they were very valid. We needed some jurisdiction over, these pharmaceutical companies. And so they started kind of putting their stamp of approval, FDA approved, and Synthroid was one of the first. And there were thyroid hormones that were being used before that. And that was typically what we were using was something called desiccated thyroid extract, DTEs, which are drugs like MP thyroid, Armour thyroid, and there's a host of other ones. Some have been taken off the market. Well, to recall, those were not FDA approved because the FDA wasn't on the scene when they first came on the scene. Okay. So that did not make them invaluable medications. They still were valuable, but they sort of kind of got cast aside, and then everything became, well, this is FDA approved, so it's better. And that's not necessarily true. Okay, it may be good for some people, maybe not for others. And so in my case, the doctor I saw wanted to put me on Armour Thyroid. And Armour Thyroid, which is a desiccated thyroid extract, comes from pig. Okay, so thyroid glands, porcine thyroid gland, and it essentially is T4 and T3. Okay, and there are some other thyroid hormones, but their significance is really not fully understood. But the main ones are T3 and T4. So Armour Thyroid gives you T4 and T3, and works for many, many people. And in my case, my T3 just wouldn't come up with the Armour Thyroid. We kept kind of going up in the dose, and my T3 just kind of sat in that 2-point zone, and I wanted it over 3.5. And I also didn't feel good. I still wasn't getting there. So I ended up, believe it or not, switching to down the road to levothyroxine, which is the T4. But then I added something called liothyronine, which is T3. And the beauty of this method, and it may not be everyone's method, but in my case, the beauty of this method is you can titrate each one individually. If you only need to go up on T3, then you only go up on liothyronine. If you need to go up on T4, then you go up on T4, and you can really titrate the dosing. Liothyronine is a twice-a-day dosed medication most of the time, sometimes 3 times a day. It has a shorter half-life in the body, and so we tend to dose it twice a day. So it's a medicine you have to remember second time in the day, which is tough for some people.
So how do you, with that in mind, how do you titrate the T3? There's some caveats with T3, right?
Slowly,
right.
Because the idea is if you start someone on too high of a thyroid dose, they're going to feel very jittery, like they're coming out of their skin. I've actually felt this before. It's an uneasy feeling, and your thyroid's just too high, okay? And so we go very, very slow. We start at the lowest dose of liothyronine and go up by 5s. But the dosing of liothyronine is interesting. It goes from 5 to 25 to 50 to 75. So it jumps by 25, but we don't jump patients by 25. We usually don't jump them by 5s. And we teach titration methods to patients. And again, I have patients who do absolutely fine on just levothyroxine alone. I have patients who do great on desiccated thyroid extract like Armour and MP Thyroid. And I have those who fail both of those methods like myself and end up on the levothyroxine T3 liothyronine combination. And this is where it becomes very individual. You don't treat everybody the same. And we listen to symptoms. It's so, so important to listen to symptoms. I will share something that I learned at our last conference. We went to a conference in Miami, a hormone symposium, and there was a woman who gave a talk on thyroid. It was excellent. And she put up a slide of children, okay? There was a study on thousands of healthy children. So you had to be healthy to be in the study, age 0 to 18. And what they did is they did lab draws on them to see what a normal T3 looks like. And I'll use the 18-year-old as a reference because I found it really fascinating. And to me, an 18-year-old is just a little perfect, a healthy 18-year-old is a perfect little adult, okay? And the T3 of an 18-year-old, okay, in this study was 4.2 to 7.5.
The average.
That was
right.
the average. Whereas I just told you the adult reference range is 2.3 to 4.2. So do you see the problem? We overly rely on reference ranges. And what are reference ranges? They're based on the population. So you technically are polling the population who is getting labs. Well, who's the population getting labs? Usually older people and usually people who don't feel good. Okay.
Right.
So
right.
we don't do thyroid generally on children unless they're complaining of something. And so this was a really interesting study, which kind of really points to the fact that our reference range is skewed. So I just love that because I try to teach my patients that because some people will sit at like 4.5 with their T3, TSH looks beautiful and they feel great and I won't move them. You don't just go changing people's doses based on numbers,
Treat the patient.
Treat the patient.
So to wrap this up, relate this. So you started with desiccated thyroid, then you went to the combination T4, T3. You were started on liothyronine. So once you got your thyroid optimized, you got your T3. What happened? How did your symptoms improve, and what did you learn?
Unbelievable. Prior to being fully treated, I had the 17 pounds on me. That started to come off. I was always cold. I couldn't even touch a patient without them jumping. They'd be like, oh, you're so freezing cold, your fingertips. And that never happened anymore. I wasn't tired anymore. I didn't want naps at 3, 4 p.m. I could think clearly. I had really good, cognition and clarity. I didn't have as dry skin. I mean, there were a plethora. My hair started growing better. So I really saw improvement in my symptoms and honestly, my well-being in life.
So we're about halfway through what we actually want to get through as usual.
There we go.
It's okay. We got a little bit of time. So the bottom line for right now is the thyroid hormone is related. It's kind of the orchestrator of all kinds of other things going on in the body. A lot of times we don't adequately treat it. And then there's multiple different ways that we can treat it. We need to treat the patient, not the symptoms. So for round 2, we'll talk about what it's associated with, suboptimal thyroid, and we'll talk a little bit more about treatment.
Perfect. Thank you.
Awesome.